everywhere from being homeless on the streets of Las Vegas to incarceration in the Michigan prison system for a term of 5 years. He never had a chance for rehabilitation or any kind of assistance with his dependency, but he nonetheless overcame his struggle with drugs and will now be celebrating 3 times, as we say, clean in June. After struggling with the first 2 years while in prison, he immersed himself into his 2 great passions, music and poetry. These creative efforts became a refuge for him and also inspired him into an emotional release from the bondage of self-consciousness and self-absorption and circumstance. And upon being released from prison on December the 29th, 2015, Steve moved to Hot Springs Village to be with his family and start a new life. Since being there, he's been a featured poet at The Collective, which is the coffee house at the very end of Bathhouse Row, which has poetry readings every Wednesday night with the Poets Roundtable. He's been in the open mic session, and also he was the featured poet. And he was also on this program that evening, Josh Williams' Red Door program, presenting many of his poetry, many of his poems. And I myself was a featured poet and was also on Josh Williams' program, and I heard his poetry and I considered it, well, the sort of poetry that I have been striving to write and to express what he has found in his, as they say in, sociology or psychology, self-actualization, self-realization, and a inspiration into a whole different identity which he continues to create with his poetry. Steve, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
You know, you told me that you had titled one of your first poems when you first went into prison, Metamorphosis, but one before that I heard was Words. And it's the words that set you free. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. Of course, that's in the Bible of the Old Testament, but what would you like to begin reading with your poetry?
Actually, Words is the most recent poem that I wrote, so I think I'll start with that. I think I'll start with Words. It's kind of self-explanatory. Here it is. It's titled Words. I wrote this about 3 weeks ago. Waiting for the words which are settled on my tongue, wasting away the words to this song. Who am I to speak of dreams or the wings of love, gift-wrapped hope from the heavens above? Who am I to share my soul with broken breath or to preach the pain of a father's death? Who am I to tell the tale of a mother's might and the beauty she holds with an endless fight? Who am I to ask for forgiveness, to pardon my crime for trying to fit life between these lines? Who am I to take your time with wasted words or to pierce your ears with that which I've learned, waiting for the words which have settled on my tongue, wasting away the words to this song? So,
that's pretty terrific. Your next poem, you said, was that the one that you called Metamorphosis?
There's one more. Metamorphosis is in a series of 4, and there's one prior to it called Reasons. And there's a sequence of 4 poems that kind of outline, starting with current use. Reasons was written when I was still using in prison. And
using drugs.
Yes, using drugs.
And it is possible, since I've worked in prisons for about 51 years, it is very, very easy to get drugs and alcohol and just about any kind of substance that can change your chemical state and your state of being. So I think that's something to point out to the people here. Although you were in prison, you still had to make a conscious effort to become clean and to get off drugs.
That's correct. And Reasons was written when I was still using, and then it moves on to Metamorphosis, which is me coming to that realization that I need to, change my life, or I'm never going to be free, not only of the physical prison, but the prison of self. So, but this is Reasons. Lost among the loneliest crowd, the echoes of silence resound, defending the shadows with invisible wars that are waged upon the shores of my soul. While hope has waded into a grave that I sold, for the price of a dime and a chemical throne, where I settle old scores by the drinks that I pour, with hands that have worn the flesh to the bone, by the lies that I've held and the stones which I've thrown. While dancing answers are left in severed chances, bleeding need I wait in vacant trances, haunted by the faces I buried in these places. The forlorn hope and the agony of need left me pleading, bleeding on my knees. As I reached for reasons, all I had left were these.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to point out that I had my first experience with somebody who had been in prison for many, many years when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. A man named Kenneth Rexroth, who was a poet who performed with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, jazz and poetry, and for whom many people credited the whole term beatnik to the entire poetic movement of that time, which was really launched by, well, Allen Ginsberg with the reading of Howl, which was done in the studio of Kenneth Rexroth, who shared it with Fred Hawks, the man I dedicated my first book of poetry to, a painter, an abstract expressionist. But anyway, I was just an undergraduate, and I was a sophomore, and Rexroth came and he said, next year there's a man getting out of prison. Could he come stay with you? And I said, sure. I had a house that I was renting there. I didn't know what it was like. This man had been inside prison, well, for about 8 years, and he was only a few years older than me, but he seemed like an old, wise man. When I met him, he seemed like a pretty tough character, too, and his name was Ray Bremser. And I accompanied him to make several broadcasts in the Philadelphia area. He had already become famous as a poet, recognized by people like Allen Ginsberg, and had been a published poet. But because of certain things he revealed about what happens in the prisons, the availability of drugs, and some of the unconscionable cruelty that is enacted upon prisoners, people there, his parole was revoked, and he was taken back to prison, and I thought I would never see him again. Many years later, when I was a professor of poetry at the University of California and San Diego State, I invited Allen Ginsberg to come out and give readings. This was a long time afterwards. It was from 1958 to 1970, all right? I called New York City to talk to Allen, and they told me to call his farm, Cherry Valley, New York. And when I talked on the phone, I said, I recognize your voice. Who are you? And he said, I'm Ray Bremser. I said, what? He said, yeah. I manage the farms for Allen Ginsberg for young men who get out of prison and who are writing poetry. Now, isn't that a wonderful story of success? Ray Bremser died just a few years ago, unfortunately, from the abuse of alcohol and from the abuse of actually smoking tobacco, lung cancer, and emphysema. But he produced several books of poetry and helped to rehabilitate many people who had begun writing in prison. I've also had the wonderful opportunity of working with a man named Rick Clucci, who was on death row at San Quentin, received a pardon, and organized a theater group called The Cage. Only convicted murderers could be in his play. He performed that play at San Quentin. Governor Pat Brown came to watch it and said, I want every prison in California to see this. I met him in 1965. I was working the Synagogue program. Many years later, again, 1972, he had been released, as had all of the members of the theater, on the condition they continued to be in theater. And he was discovered by Samuel Beckett, whose work he had performed as he was awaiting execution, a one-man show called Kraft's Last Tape. Samuel Beckett asked him to perform it for him there in the Hempstead Brown Theater. He did, and Beckett said, from now on, you'll be the only director of my works. Come with me to Berlin. That's pretty amazing, to go from death row, where you're performing a play by a Nobel Prize winner, and years later, that Nobel Prize winner says, you're my man, you're going to direct my plays. There was a film Nick Nolte played in called Weeds. It was not a true representation of this story. But you're a true representation of what can happen. I stopped off by a friend's house today and told him to please listen to this program. He was inside for 23 years. He has now been outside 25 years, and he helps me with the maintenance of my halfway houses for people. I work in prisons and have for 51 years, clarion call. And he said he definitely wants to hear this program, and he's listening in right now. So this is for you, Edward. Steve, could you read some more poems? I think your poetry is worth listening to.
Thank you. This is Metamorphosis. It's about the realization of needing to change.
And the word metamorphosis I first learned when I was in the 8th grade, and we were told to write an essay about metamorphosis. I love the word.
It's a beautiful word.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful concept. Metamorphosis. Centuries of intention are cast in a cradle of skin, while the bones of hope have held the weight of what has never been. The sacred ache and struggle to bear, a burden of hurt with sins to declare. In the saving grace to betray despair, a taste of faith came with an answered prayer. As acceptance framed the mirror's stare, intuition whispered, "This is why you are there." While forgiveness glistened through ancient affairs, and wisdom listened to truth's premiere, hope transcended the broken years to become the man standing here.
Well, I love the word metamorphosis, but I also love the word, and it's funny because even though I'm a writer and I've completed a doctorate in America and in England, I'm always learning new words, and I could never remember the word or understand chrysalis. The chrysalis is when it's the moment, that one moment when the cocoon opens and the caterpillar, which is embedded itself in the cocoon, crawls out and becomes a butterfly. And there's an old joke that some people, when they come out of their chrysalis, don't become butterflies, but become toads if they haven't planned it correctly. And I have a New Yorker cartoon in my house, which I think, Zach, you may have seen on the wall. And it's a butterfly looking over at a chrysalis as he's crawling out and saying, "You've got to really want to change." Well, this change, let's keep on going, because I know your next poem, or two, this is
Yes, my next two deal with 4.5 years, 4 years into my prison sentence, I was granted parole to a intensive in-prison residential substance abuse treatment program.
Substance abuse treatment program.
Yes.
There are some of those, and they do. I actually serve our 2 prisons here, and I help with substance abuse rehabilitation. I'll be doing it on Monday, tomorrow night, and on Friday. Please.
Part of the nature of addiction is impulsiveness. You know, I'm an impulsive person.
Oh.
And so one of the things that I explored while in that program was patience. So this poem is titled "Kneeling to Patience." Standing in shambles and speaking in haste, intentions are different from this desire embraced. Kneeling to patience and tasting its taste, in the solace of silence with the acceptance of grace. In gathering the calm and composure of haste, sovereignty restrains spontaneous mistakes. While syllables are spoken, assumptions awake, the perception of truth that understanding creates. Rising in reverence with wisdom which waits, kneeling to patience these decisions I make, are bound in each sentence with decency displayed, and intentions truly different among thoughts that still remain. And
That's really terrific. We talked about some other poems, but we talked about some guitar work you did, and I don't want to take very much time on that, but you did have a little piece. I wonder if you could play just a portion of the piece you wrote, which you called Metamorphosis.
I can do that. Give me 1 second while I get my guitar
It's
here.
right here, and there you are. What was it that B.B. King called his guitar?
Lucille?
Lucille. Yeah. Lucille. Okay. Do you have a name for your guitar?
This is Sally.
No,
Her name is Sally. After, I don't know if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, wrote a story called, it included a dream city called Celiphae. So this is Sally for short.
Well, pretty good. Everything's a wonderful literary reference here. Thank you. You made a remark to me while we had our interview yesterday that art is how we decorate space. Music is how we decorate time. But if you don't mind me making a personal observation, some of the art that you have decorated the space on your arms with are in recognition of some of the more significant figures in the literary world. I mentioned something about Neil Cassidy, who spent most of his life in prison for possession of a substance called cannabis, marijuana. And yet he was the model as Moriarty, as the character of On the Road, written by Jack Kerouac, his best friend, Dean Moriarty. But he was Neil Cassidy. And Neil Cassidy wrote his own book called First Third, published by Ferlinghetti, the City Lights bookstore
in San Francisco. Yeah.
And it's amusing to me how many people wear Levi's. Levi's were not popular until 1952, the publication of On the Road. And now people put tears in them to show they've been on the road for a while. I am bemused as well as amused. And then I'll ask the people, have you read Jack Kerouac? And they'll say, huh? Who? Kind of like my own daughter in Spain said she was going to go run with the bulls in Pamplona. I said, have you read Hemingway? And she said, who? Of course, that all comes from the running of the bulls from, it's called in Spanish, well, it's called The Sun Also Rises. And it takes place at the Feria, the fair of San Isidro, of the bulls, the running of the bulls in Pamplona. Anyway, a lot of people don't know the military, but you have a reference to Neil Cassidy on your arm, the last numbers that he said as he was driving Ken Kesey's magic bus, which was called Further, right?
Which is also a tattoo on my arm as well, yes.
Okay, the last bus he was driving across country with a bunch of, frankly, stoned out hippies, all of them on LSD, playing Carmina Burana, which I'm going to play on this program sometime to let you hear what was played, going cross country. They were going to celebrate Timothy Leary's birthday up in New York. They went cross country. LSD was still illegal until September the 14th, 1966. How do I know the date? Because we were using it legally in 1965 with the man who had introduced Aldous Huxley to it at Menninger Foundation, and we were using it with cancer terminal patients in the Veterans Hospital in San Diego, and reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the way Aldous Huxley went out. That's all funny. It's a lot of nonsense, a lot of stuff. But LSD was a big, heavy thing. What was the number he kept repeating?
64,928. Supposedly it was the number that he said before he died.
And I knew his wife in England, who was a member of the Chelsea Arts Club with me. She wrote Off the Road, a book about what it was like to live with Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy, and to have Allen Ginsberg around the house all the time, and they named their son John Allen Cassidy. And what a character she was. She even knew William Burroughs and used to talk about how he washed his 6 cats every night, tying their feet together in the bathtub. Oh, I cannot, I don't even want to think about it. Anyway, what else have you got that is
Well, the next poem I have is deals again with the treatment program. I actually wrote it during a group session. It's called The Standstill Clock, and it's about the healing powers of group and how time seems to stop when...
You're talking about 12-step recovery groups.
It was an intensive... This wasn't...
It's just group therapy.
Yeah, it's group therapy,
Okay.
Intensive group therapy.
First time I attended something like that was Synanon. That's what they had. And they had halfway houses that people could not leave. But they had sessions all day long. And they were really tough.
Yeah, there's 4 hours a day of intensive group, and there was quite. The program wasn't volunteer. I was forced to do it, and as were everyone else there. We weren't given a choice. The parole board said you have to do this, or you're not going to be released. So, which made it difficult because a lot of people didn't want to change, didn't want the help. They were there because they were forced to be there. And that's the way I was when I was first there. I wasn't so happy about being there, but then I opened myself up and became willing to accept the possibility.
Yeah, I'm hoping our friend Zach will say,
Steve, so what was it that changed when, internally with you as you were forced into this program? What switched to make you want it to succeed?
The switch actually came long before that. It was about 2 years into my 5 year. Well, it ended up being, I was sentenced 4 years to 60 years, and is my, I'd never been to rehab or any type of recovery program. That's just, they said 4 to 60, and it turned out to be.
And
5
so you kept using in prison.
The first 2 years, I was pretty resentful and angry at the fact that I was sentenced to so much time. And then I got in trouble in prison for getting high. I failed a urine screen. And when I called home to tell my mother what happened, and there was no, she wasn't surprised anymore. There was no, it had become the normal for her to expect that. And when I heard that, just whatever that sound was in her voice, or lack of sound in her voice on the telephone, something clicked in my head, and from that moment, just a switch went off, and it was time to do something different. And so for the next, couple years, next 2 years, I put myself into learning to play the guitar. I never knew how to play the guitar before I went to prison. It's been about 3 years now I've been playing, and writing. And when I got to the program, that kind of gave me the direction and tools, I guess to say, would be the proper term, to how to identify emotions, do things that I never learned how to do, since I was a teenager, because I had opiates in my life to numb the pain and not just the pain of pain, but the feelings of happiness, sadness, all emotions that I had, dealt with were with opiates in my system. So when I got to that program, it kind of gave, when I opened up and became willing to accept it, and I was fortunate to have a really helpful counselor who recommended a very moving book to me, which was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl. His experience in Auschwitz, and it's the beginning of my book, my first book, well, my last book, Duende. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz prison by remembering a poem where the key line was "Lux tenebris," the very small flickering light at the end of the tunnel, at the end of that tunnel, and that, of course, became a book that became a guide in logotherapy, he called it. And he was, Viktor Frankl survived it, although he thought he kept his wife's image in his mind. When they arrived at Auschwitz, they were separated. And he thought he would see them again. They actually cremated her gassed her and cremated her on the very day they arrived. Mm-hmm. So when he came out, he had merely his lux tenebris.
Nothing, no family,
but
nothing.
He had a belief system which had given him a way of surviving, which has given, frankly, millions of people since then. It's been translated in multiple languages. Viktor Frankl.
Very good book.
And it's wonderful. It helps a lot of people.
This next poem it's called "The Standstill Clock," and I wrote it during group. It was a pretty emotional day. There was several tears shed during that group, and I read this during the group. It's called "The Standstill Clock." The clockwork crept to standing still, in subtle shame, the empty feel of tamed regrets by servitude to broken thoughts and devil's food. A feast of words the servant served, to tongues undone as judgment comes, from the reflected eyes of resentment some. In mercy's thirst for tears that hung, through cries which died on confession's lung, a humble heart broke among the tide of hope as sin succumbed to conquered fears and pursuit of love. With a forge of friends and freedom's thought, who interpret truth to a tempered cross, we bear the weight that patience wrought. While feelings learned what acceptance taught, gratitude gleamed its silent cost, and seized the beliefs changing brought from the turning gears of the standstill clock.
That's really amazing. Now, what you told me that is quite remarkable, I was sharing with some of the people, well, my friend I just visited this morning, who actually helps me with our halfway houses, which are called Happy Destiny Homes. I have people who come out of prison. He is one of our advisors. He was in for 23 years, and he's been out clean and sober for 25. But when I told him, he was actually in hole, we talked about being in the hole, he was in for 1 solid year. But you were allowed, not only in your prison time, but in the hole, to keep a notebook. And you showed me your notebook. But this was a notebook you were able to write in your notebook.
Well, what ended up happening is the day before, it was a 6-month program, that substance abuse program was, and the day before graduation, I got kicked out of the program, and for confronting a peer who was in my group for lying. Lying was an issue of his, and they teach you to challenge and confront people and all that stuff in the program. And so I called him out on lying. He had said his sister died from a heroin overdose, and I had found out that to be false. My mother had contacted her on Facebook, and she accepted the friend request.
But you had confronted him.
I confronted
and they
him.
considered it not a challenge, but a confrontation.
They said that I broke confidentiality because I had released his name over the telephone to my mother. So they kicked me out of the program, and I was put in a parole violators unit where, when I was out on the prison yard one day kicking a soccer ball and doing push-ups and whatnot, my neighbor, being the gentleman that he was, decided that seeing he's going to be released in 4 days, he didn't have money. He was going to go in my cell while I was on the yard, and he planted a knife in my room.
No, he planted a knife which sabotaged you and made you guilty of a very severe crime in prison, and you were put in the hole for how long?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. The whole idea of being in the hole is, of course, I just kind of reiterate some of the things. I've worked in prisons a long time, over 50 years. Some of the prisons, as you say, it was in the middle of summer, no air conditioning. You're only allowed a shower to wash your body how often?
Twice a week.
Twice a week. You do have a basin, and so you can do a little kind of a spit bath, or whatever you call it there, and you do have your own toilet. But your meals are very low-grade, low-protein meals. They don't want you to have, and in some of them, it literally is only bread and water. My friend that told me about his experience in Texas, it was virtually a starvation diet. But you had no contact with other people. You were not allowed to go exercise outside, so you had to do it all inside. And it's a very severe, and let me ask this. There's an old thing you hear in prison. The lights are always on.
There's never quiet, there's never darkness.
And there's always noise. Most people, when they come out of prison, get a set of earplugs, and they cherish the dark and being able to sleep.
When I was released, it was discombobulating the darkness. It took me a few weeks to get used to
a lot of people have
the
a lot of
darkness
trouble.
and the quiet.
This is why I've been working with people for many, many years, and I just want to let our audiences know what goes on in some of the prisons. And this was a crime of which you were not guilty. You did not have a hearing. You had no confrontation by constitutional rights of your accuser. It's just the way it is. But this happens all the time. And yet, you've come out of this, creating things. We have other artists. I have Buddy Ledbetter here, Leadbelly. I have Merle Haggard. A lot of people think Johnny Cash did time. He did not, but he certainly did go to the prisons and try to help. The first novelist of all time was doing a hard time in a prison in Madrid, Spain. His name was Miguel Cervantes, and he wrote Don Quixote, the first novel of all time. We also have the father of most of the Arthurian legends, Sir Thomas Malory, Morte d'Arthur. He was doing time in prison. I've mentioned already Aldous Huxley. He wrote Brave New World, but it was modeled upon a book called We, written many years before like 20-some years, by Zamyatin, Igor Zamyatin, who was put in a stalag, in a prison camp in Russia. But we have We. We have 1984 modeled also on that, and also Invitation to a Beheading modeled on that. Ayn Rand's Anthem modeled on that. There have been a lot of people who've been able to speak out from prisons and show that the voice of the earth, even Sir Walter Raleigh was awaiting his beheading in the Tower of London when he wrote his History of the World. Pretty amazing, but pretty strong conditions. One of the things I say to the men in prisons, use this experience as a kind of monastery or a boot camp of the spirit. You can use this to reform, restructure, re-envision yourself. Will you let us hear some more?
Yes, I'll share this brief one. This was written while I was in the hole, as you said. They had.
Hera?
Oh no. Well, I can share here with you first, I guess, if you would like. That would be all right. This was actually the first. We're not supposed to have notebooks in prison.
Well, that's the whole point. That you were able to get a notebook and keep it, and they let you have it in the hole.
They did. And this is the first poem that I entered in when I got my notebook. It's called Here. Down below your mighty throne, I stand inside your vacant dreams, knowing a truth you couldn't conceive. I am the rabble and the rubble that you leave, the sum of nothing to you it seems. Here I stand, and here I thrive, alone in your emptiness at the edges of your lives. Here I become alive. Outside your box of money and lies, I stand at the gate to your kingdom of fear. I see you profit from blood, sweat, and tears. A society lost in the anesthetized deceit by the wicked iniquity of the corporate divinity. And here I watch, here I write, alone in the emptiness at the edges of your lives. Here I become alive. Inside your justified crimes, within your lucid sins, the abyss has risen to make acquaintance with diabolical eyes. And in their reflection the wasteland begins, where evil devises sinister designs. Here I fear, and here I find, tears for cries and smiles for lies, from silver spoon leaders to the strung-out crucified. Down below your mighty throne, here I watch, and here I write. Here I stand, and here I thrive. Here I fear, and here I find. Here I am alive.
Wow. And what period was that when you wrote that?
That was March of 2014.
Okay, that's what I have written down here. But what about Hera? Was that a poem that you had?
No.
That's nothing else. What was the other one that you wrote? Father?
The Father or the Son?
Yeah. Was that about the same time?
That was
a year later.
That was about a year later, and that was about turning on every time I would. In prison, they use television as almost like a babysitter, you know, to appease the masses.
Television is enough to destroy the mind.
And so every time I would turn on the television, there would be some sort of negative, something on the news or some terrible commercial, or and that's what inspired me to write this. It's called The Father or the Son. Ivory tower promises and deception of innocence, feeding the masses suburban dreamed sighs, subtlety conformed to political disguise, a mask well worn by thieves whom hide in the diplomatic shell of televised lies. While sorrow sells the tick-tock bell of Wall Street crimes and the jihad hell, prescription martyrs, they barter souls for corporate ladders and tea-time tolls. Bleeding blackness from desert skin folds, the ecological apostles who pillage Earth's soul of the colossal fossils and yesterday's gold, mining the cries with diamond fund guns and lining the lies with slush fund sums. Warehoused humans in prison slums, accumulating worth as numbered scum. But what came first, and which is worse, the Father or the Son? For I am He, and you are me. When shall we learn our lesson and see?
Well, that's pretty remarkable. But you also told me about a poem that you wrote when you just came out of the hole called Exile Claimed Hope.
Exiles claim, hopes remains.
Wait,
yes.
Let's hear that again.
Exiles claim, or hopes remains.
That plural, exiles.
Yes.
Exiles claimed,
yes,
or hopes remain. And this is one day after you.
The day after I was released from
the
being in the hole for 3
Okay.
weeks. Yes. Tears of love and tears of loss, the fear of hope contains their cost. Where stands this dam, a river flowed, through depths of years its leagues unfold, to drown the plains of exile's claim, and wash a heart with hope's remains. All the love and all the loss hung as truth among my cross. The skin that's built by legends told holds this life and cradled soul. To break the bond of exile's claim, I found my faith in hope's remains. This I've loved and this I've lost, a Savior's grace, a burdened cross. Where stood that dam, a river flows, to cleanse the years its waters roll. They flood the plain of exile's claim, and replace the waste with hope's remains.
That's really something, to be able to write that your day out of the hole. It's curious. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison in a kind of confinement where it was at hard labor, breaking up rock with a sledgehammer. Maybe that's why he lived into his 90s, because he was so physically fit. But I used to ask my students, who is Nelson Mandela? And they would say, well, he's president of Africa, or he's this, that. What they didn't say was he was an attorney at law, or he would not have survived. He was actually facing death sentences on 3 different occasions for high treason, and he defended himself as an attorney at law. And then, what was amazing, and the reason I bring his name up is because I want to draw a parallel here between himself, yourself, and a person you mentioned, Viktor Frankl. When he came out, he said, and was elected president, he said, as long as these people will confess to what they did to our people, we will let them go, and they will have amnesty. And many people were very upset about that. It would be like forgiving all of those stormtroopers who brought about the deaths of millions of not just Jews, but gypsies and all kinds of differing people in the death camps. Viktor Frankl was asked at a convention of psychotherapists where he spoke and talked about his experiences. Somebody stood up and in a rage said, "Didn't you hate those people? Didn't you want to kill all of them?" And from what I've been told by one of the psychotherapists, Dr. Martine Carroll, who attended that, he said, no, the man said very quietly, no, I wanted to understand what could ever make people do what they did. And that is what it's all about. Learning to understand how people could do what they did. I want to read one poem I wrote, which strangely enough, many years ago, became popular in the prisons in America, was published in several magazines. We had started a newspaper called Home Cooking with the ex-convicts from the Oklahoma State Prison. Mason Williams, whose music I'm going to play next year, had written a song which launched this particular project and made it a best-selling underground newspaper called Home Cooking. His own father had died in the state penitentiary. Mason Williams may not be remembered now. One of his songs, though, the one I'm going to play, is called Classical Gas, and I was told by his best friend, with whom he's published many things, that he still gets a lot of money every year. You hear it everywhere. I even heard it when I was on the Please Hold, when I was calling the Veterans Administration, they played Classical Gas. And I'm hoping they would play it as music in all of the elevators, because it's a very beautiful little song. But Mason wrote a song about the Oklahoma roads and the little paths in the outback wilderness there, and it launched our newspaper, Home Cooking, which reformed that entire prison where many people had been killed by some oppression in the 1970s. But I just want to read this one poem, and then I want to play Classical Gas. My poem was called A Poet's Conviction. A poet must be felonious, anything less, and he will miss the meaning of being more than a man, an animal. Bounty on him hiding in his word hoard, roaring in the night, torment to all, the silent majority especially, dangerous and armed only with the dark root of a scream. Strikes dead the moribund, sheltering to silence the radio mind's programming, commercials we strive by, criminally intent, undermining all pretense, short of life sentence and no time off for good behavior. And when you read that last poem, I thought of that because you were talking about how we are programmed by these commercials. We are programmed to stop thinking for ourselves. But poetry is to open up those doors of perception, to, as I played with Jim Morrison, break on through to the other side. But I'd like now to play Classical Gas by Mason Williams. You may remember him from the Smothers Brothers show, which he wrote, and they were thrown off the air for being politically incorrect in questioning what was going on at that time in Vietnam. Well, that was Mason. And Mason Williams came and lived with me on the farm back in Oklahoma when I was building the newspaper, Home Cooking, with the convicts there. Teach was the man who spent most of his time in prison, who became the editor-in-chief. We did a lot of wonderful things. We were able to help a girl named Karen Silkwood get her story. Well, she was dead, but her roommate got the story to Mike Nichols and did the film Silkwood, which was another great breakthrough. But now we're just going to say goodbye to Steve. Steve, it's been wonderful what you've shared here today, and I think you've helped more people than you could really, well, we never know. Teaching affects eternity, said John F. Kennedy. One never knows where its influence will stop.